I think we're moving more to a content strategy that is really driven by personal voice. I think the brand that gets out there and just gives generic frameworks and that kind of structure, it feels very programmatic and it's losing velocity. So I think all the content needs to have that editorial voice. What is the perspective, and is that really shown in the writing that comes across? The brands that are just going to stay with that very high level, I think they're going to increasingly lose ranking and increasingly fall off.
I'm joined by Casey Hill from DoWhatWorks. Casey, thank you for setting the time to speak with us.
Absolutely.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely. So I'm the CMO of DoWhatWorks, and I've been in the B2B SaaS space for about 13 years. So it's undergone quite an evolution in that time. And besides that, I also am an educator. I work at UC Davis and Stanford Extension, teaching around the evolution of demand gen in modern marketing.
What type of people do you teach, Casey?
Yeah, so it's a whole spread. We have graduate students, and we also have people from all around the world that come to Stanford Extension programs to kind of learn what is cutting edge. So it is not confined only by Stanford students. So it's a spattering combination of the two.
And what do you see gap that exists in terms of knowledge for adopting or adapting to bigger challenges in marketing, to changes in technology? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so I think one of the first big gaps is practical. So when I first started hiring people, especially entry-level people right out of college, one of the reasons I got into the education in general was because I found that they weren't able to operate in the actual systems. They knew the theory, they knew about the funnel, they knew about buyer psychology, but they couldn't run a Google campaign. They didn't know how to be effective on LinkedIn or on Reddit or on X or these different channels. So that I think is super important for the modern marketer, to have that actual execution side. And we've seen over the last couple of years, massive changes off the back of AI that are changing how people search, how people find information. One huge example is there was an update on Google called the Hidden Gems update. And based on that update, they were trying to find out, how do we not let programmatic AI content take over? All these companies were just flooding in AI content.
Casey, when was that update?
That was about a year or two ago.
A year or two ago.
Yeah,
Okay.
a year or two. Hidden Gems update at Google, yeah. And so as a byproduct, to counteract that, what they started to do is they started to look at places like Reddit. There was actually a licensing agreement between Google and between Reddit. They started to look at places like LinkedIn. They started to even pull short form video. So while conventional blogs started to dive, there's a lot of stories about HubSpot's blog saw a 70% decrease and all these other massive trends. We see that they started to source information from things that were harder to replace with AI, i.e. personal outlets. It's harder to replace a Reddit story or someone's post. And they started using that as attribution and pulling those things in. And so as a byproduct, marketers have to adapt. We have to start to go to the new channels. We have to start to change our strategies. Doesn't mean that the blog is dead. I don't believe that blogs are dead, but it does mean that the way that we build blogs, the way that we construct that content needs to have more personal narrative. It needs to have more of the things that are currently ranking and currently being used as attribution inside of those AI tools. And people need to optimize, they call it AIO optimization, AI overview optimization, as well as just standard search optimization. So I think it's a pretty profound change.
So people are reaching out to get trained on how to respond to these type of changes. And you mentioned that the web content is not disappearing, but how should these web properties evolve to respond to that the hidden gem kind of change, right? Traffic acquisition costs are increasing. It's harder than before. So if you can talk a little bit about how web properties should adapt and probably what the role of SEO would be in the modern day.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one is when you think about distribution and how we distribute content, I would advise people that have had primarily, like if all your content has been living on the blog, those companies should ask themselves, are we publishing on LinkedIn and talking about interesting snippets to pull people in? Are we in Reddit? That's very atypical for conventional folks. It's this zone that has been felt like it's very consumer oriented, but the best brands, Reddit traffic is up 500%. Right? If you go and you look at SEMrush. And so the best brands are finding ways to build community and have meaningful conversations, not just advertising, but share the same stories, the same narratives in those spaces. And we've seen video have a huge rise. LinkedIn just released the video feed, and now people are trying to figure out how to optimize for those 60-second bites. But overall, we see that there's a tremendous amount of velocity on those channels. And Google is even using as attribution. This has happened over the last 12 months. It's been fascinating. I've seen them using TikTok. I've seen them using Instagram Reels, actually used as sources, as things that are linked out and cited for content. So we're seeing some pretty profound changes there. So the first thing is I would make sure that I had a omnichannel attack strategy, if you will, on those different places. And then in the content itself, I think we're moving more to a content strategy that is really driven by personal voice. I think the brand that gets out there and just gives generic frameworks and that kind of structure, it feels very programmatic and it's losing velocity. So I think all the content needs to have that editorial voice. What is the perspective, and is that really shown in the writing that comes across? The brands that are just going to stay with that very high level, I think they're going to increasingly lose ranking and increasingly fall off, where the people that feature personal stories, that give their own the author's anecdotal experience, that contextualizes and flushes out, that content will continue to perform better because it's much harder to emulate with just a basic AI engine.
Casey, what's the role of testing in this landscape in order to test, to make sure that you find out what works, right? What type of voice resonates better with those customers? You probably need to have a more structured approach versus just trying something out, waiting for a few months, and then revisiting next year. What's the role of testing?
Yeah, so there's two sides. The first thing I think is super important is you want to have a very targeted goal. What are you trying to accomplish with this thing? For example, LinkedIn is one of the channels that I spend a lot of time on. I've generated well over 10 million views across LinkedIn in the last 365 days. And when I think about LinkedIn, people often want to know, where do I start? What kind of content do I share? And I say a lot of this is pared down to what your goals are. If you're at a stage where you want to build following, you want to expand the amount of people that see your content, you're going to need to get away from your product. You're going to need to focus on the industry. When people use the word thought leader, which kind of has a bad reputation today, it means that someone's associating you with that topic. So like I like to be associated with organic growth. A lot of the stuff I'm sharing is about organic growth, experimentation, learnings in that space. So I need to take a step back from name dropping my product and talk more broadly. Like I call that third degree content, which is that middle zone, right? Now, let's say that you've spent some of that due diligence and you've built a big audience. Like an example, Jason Lemkin, who runs SaaSter, he has hundreds of thousands of followers. He's a big player in the B2B SaaS space. So for him, it makes a lot more sense for him to do more direct plugs of SaaSter. He has the reach, he has the audience. He wrote recently, he's getting 40 million views per year. So at that point, he should be doing more stuff about why SaaSter, like really drilling down on his product, his core offering. So I think part of it is starting with strategy and intentionality. Don't just say, hey, LinkedIn, okay, we're gonna repurpose our blogs there. Really think carefully about the channel and go in from that standpoint. The other thing I think it's really important when we think about testing is starting from a foundation of data. So often we iterate and we test and it's only based on anecdotal experiences. So at DoWhatWorks, that's one of the things that we're really passionate about. So we basically have a technology that can crawl the web, see any split test that is being done across the web, identify with computer vision what is being tested, and then our team tracks it and ultimately creates a database where people can come in and they can say, for a B2B SaaS company pricing page, we find that defaulting to annual but displaying it as monthly is the best practice. And we can help guide those best practices so that someone doesn't go through 10 iterations of just testing based on that personal experience before they land there. So I'm very bullish about team strength to start from a point of data and understanding when you run tests, so you save a ton of time and resources by not doing things that don't work.
Got it. So companies that you approach are already testing, right? They are already mature enough to structure their own tests. And what they are looking for is referential data on what other people are testing. And they're trying to gather insight. How do you know if they are doing well? You're just tracking, or primarily tracking who is testing on what? And my second question will be, what are you discovering in terms, because the end user is completely unaware that they are under a test, right? That they are being tested on certain elements of a page.
Yeah. So we operate from a few core premises. The first is we operate that brands who run a test, an A/B test, will typically keep the version of that test that is better performing. We can't know that for certain, but especially if we look at kind of confidence intervals, the larger and larger that data set becomes, the more confident we become that they're testing something that is probably going to be effective in that capacity. And then what was the second part of your question?
What I was also thinking is around that is that you're also tracking what doesn't work, right? You have a lot of data around failed tests.
Absolutely. So I'm happy to share a couple of those. So one thing that gets remarkable is customer logos, for example, on the website. Most brands, actually 70% of the top 100 B2B SaaS brands have a logo bar on their website. And what's fascinating about that is when people test across pricing pages, across home pages, across product pages, it loses at an incredibly high interval. Meaning that if someone tests having customer logos or removing customer logos, the no customer logos perform substantially better. Wow. So that's a non-intuitive learning. Most people look at the industry and they see that's common practice, standard practice, so they just copy it. But when we actually see the test data, it tells a different story. So one of the things that we try to do too is not just to say, okay, if customer logos aren't working, what does work? So what does work first is to have a specific article, be it TechCrunch, be it SaaStr, be it CMS Wire, right? Whatever organization, and link out to actual content that someone can click into. Because logos tend to just be static logos. They don't know, they can't check or validate. They're just seeing almost anyone could slap it on and it could be inauthentic. But having as seen on, having real content, that works better. Having testimonials that have real context. So don't just say, we increased revenue by 50%. Instead, say, we were at 140 demos per month. We moved that to 240 demos, and we actually had to hire another AE to handle that new inbound volume within the first 2 quarters. That has real meat and context, and it's not what people just gloss over. And finally, case studies. Case studies that have real depth that are tailored to the business. And what we try to do is we try to look at what's not working, and then also make sure that we're giving people alternatives, because obviously something like social proof is important. We're not saying don't have your customers, don't have social proof, but do it in an educated way. But that's one of the things that's been fascinating. When you get into the data, you find that just because a lot of brands have that doesn't necessarily mean that is the winning thing. And that's where it's really good to see the people that actually test it and what they keep as a byproduct of that.
KJ, I think you have a lot of material for people that are trying to adapt themselves to these challenges, right? We've seen so many announcements of these new capabilities, and having a good foundation and also adapting yourself to what is, in essence, a set of new techniques, a set of new practices, and a set of new criteria to determine what actually works. Where can they find more information about you? I know you've produced quite a bit of educational content, I think, on your LinkedIn. How can somebody learn more about what type of things?
Yeah, so Casey Hill, CMO of DoWhatWorks at LinkedIn is probably the best place that I post 5 to 6 times a week. And this is very much build in public, tactical lessons of what kind of tests are working or different kind of growth insights. So that is a great place for people to find me.
Thank you so much, Casey.